Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. King's Landing 29-8 AC. Joy. She was angry and had refused to eat, had called her father and uncle names, which she didn't mean, and had refused to go to her lessons. Jaina had called her a child, told her that she was acting like a babe and not a grown lady, and she had cared not. Cregan had looked at her disappointedly, as had her father, and she had cared not. Only Balerion understood. Only he knew, and so it was only he that she listened to. You're right, Wallen. They're wrong. So what if I'm acting spoiled? I am spoiled. Then they should let me see him, shouldn't they? The one-sided conversations she had with the cat always made her feel better. He didn't judge or tell her to act a lady or to grow up and be who she needed to be. Balerion was just like Jon, and he let her be herself, even when she was wrong and others may be right. She'd understood why they'd not let her in to see him at first. He was ill. She'd heard. She wasn't a fool. The Gramsher and the prince had both been to see Jon more than once. She knew he was ill and that they didn't wish her to see. But what about what I wish? What about that? I need to see him. I need to know he's getting better. I need to kiss him and make him beller, she said, holding Balerion tightly in her arms. The days stretched on, and that she wasn't the only one who didn't get to see him didn't make it feel any better to her. What cared she that Arya or Sansa didn't get to see Jon, or that Martin, Willem, or Tommen did not either? She wanted to see him, and she knew he'd want to see her. He always had. He always did. When she was ill, or if she felt bad, it was Jon who'd come to see her and try and make her feel better. Why wouldn't they allow her to do the same for him? She ate because she knew it worried them when she did not, though she had no appetite, and she found herself wondering if Jon could eat or not. At night she slept, though it took her time to fall to sleep, her tears and worried thoughts keeping her awake for most of the night. As the days went on, she still refused to go to her lessons and had been sent to her room more than once. When she was not being punished in some way, then she and Balerion would go and stand as close to Jon's room as they were allowed to go. Joy had tried to move closer, but when she did, they'd move her to one of the other rooms or send for her father or Asha, and she'd be taken back to their own. So now she moved close, but not too close to where she could see the room, but where they'd not move her from. When she saw Loras go into the room, she had followed him back from it, sure he'd bring her inside. "Can you take me with you next time?" she asked as he walked aside. "I can't, Joy. No one is to see him." Lord Xerxes said, shaking his head. "You gotta see him," she said accusingly. I did, but you'll see him soon." Loras said, smiling a fake smile at her as he did so. "Soon, that's all any of you say. Soon, I want to see him now," she said loudly. "Joy," Lord Xerxes said, moving towards her, but she brushed his hand away and ran down the corridor, finding Balerion running into a room a little ahead of her. Entering the room, she saw Balerion in the corner, his head turned towards her, and then he moved to the wall and was gone. Panicked, she ran over and saw his head come out from the wall, Balerion looking to her before he went back into it. "You want me to come?" she asked, though he was already gone, and wasn't there to answer. Not that he ever did. She took a quick look around her and then followed after Balerion, feeling the wall close behind her, and then realizing that it was a door and not a wall. It was dark, but she could see Balerion's eye in the distance. Joy moved quickly after him, not wishing to be here alone in the dark. She lost him when he turned his head away from her, and began to worry that she'd not find him again, only to feel him rub up against her legs. Seeing the light in front of her, she ran to it and found it was a torch. It took her some time to find something to climb onto so that she could reach it, and once she did, she saw Balerion race on ahead. She followed after the black cat, the torch in her hand, not letting him disappear again, and after what felt like hours they came to another door. Balerion ducked inside and then back out, just as quickly again, and when Joy tried to walk though it, the cat hissed loudly at her. Why are you angry with me?" she said sadly, and then felt Balerion rub against her once more, the cat showing that it wasn't anger that he felt, but something else. "You're warning me? It's not time yet, is it?" she asked, feeling the cat's tongue lick her hand. She sat down on the ground and Balerion snuggled up against her, Joy welcoming the feel of his soft fur on her face, as she held him on her knees and leaned down against him. Her eyes opened and she found that it was to darkness. Joy, sure she'd fallen asleep and looking to see that the torch had gone out, Balerion was nowhere to be seen or felt, and she worried once again, only to hear a noise and look up and see the cat's eye in the darkness ahead of her. Rising to her feet, she moved toward him and was soon past the door and inside a room. The lights were low, but at least she could see again. Jaime and Jon led the way and she followed quietly behind him, opening another door and then another, and then she almost ran to the bed when she saw him. He was sleeping. He didn't look ill or unwell, and he was alone. Why had they left him alone? He shouldn't be alone. They wouldn't let her see him. And yet he was alone, she thought angrily, as she moved to the bed. "You're not alone anymore, Jon. I'm here," she said as she climbed up on the bed and lay down beside him. King's Landing? Evening. Prince Jaehaerys Targaryen. He buttoned up his dark red shirt and reached over to grab his coat, putting it on and standing in front of the looking glass to make sure he was presentable. His father had asked to speak to him before they headed to the night's feasting, and Jae wondered what it was to be about. Opening his door, he saw that Jaime had already changed, and he wondered how he had managed to do and be back so quickly. Looking at him, he shook his head and decided that it was yet another secret of the night's he would need to figure out some other time. Walking down the corridor, he was tempted to stop by Ryu's room to speak to her. He and his sister had not had much time together today, and after the present she'd made for him, which he now wore, he felt bad about that. However, his father's wishes took precedence, and so he continued on. Finding Ser Barristan and Ser Jonathor to be on duty tonight. "Is his grace inside?" he asked, seeing Ser Jonathor nod, and that he wore an odd smirk on his face. Opening the door and walking inside, he quickly found the reason for that smirk, as he looked and saw that his father wasn't alone. Lady Olenna, Lord Mace, and Marguerite were all sitting alongside his father. Elia and his grandmother, Jay, looking at them all nervously as he moved to take a seat. He bid the Tyrells to remain in their seats when they went to rise, protocol needed to be observed in front of his father, but he'd long ago talked them out of where he was concerned. "Ah, the man of the hour," his father said, his voice light, and Jay could see there was both pride and mirth in his eyes. "I got lucky. Another day and it would have been Sir Arthur who won," he said, trying to sound far more modest than he actually felt about his victory. "But not today, Yaxley," and he smiled warmly at her. "Yaxley, it's been clear to us all how you felt for Lady Margaret, and you, for some time. Political reasons, though, have delayed us agreeing to anything formal regarding a betrothal between you both. As well you know," his father said, and Yaxley felt his heart begin to beat. "A little faster." "I'm aware of that, father," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Now that you've reached your majority and the realm is far more stable, those political reasons are lessened. Your Uncle Viserys and Princess Arianne are to be wed, which gives me leave to now make a match based both on politics and one which I believe will make my son happy. So later tonight, we'll be announcing your betrothal to Lady Margaery," his father said, smiling beamingly at him. Jax looked around the room. He could see that Lady Olenna and Lord Mace were both incredibly happy by this news, and that his grandmother and Elia both seemed to be just as pleased. Marguerite looked nervously to him, and Jay didn't understand why that was for a few moments. So wrapped up was he in how he was feeling, that he didn't see that she perhaps thought he was having second thoughts, or may not now wish the match. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was not just the match he had waited for years to be confirmed. It was the only match he had ever wanted. He'd understood with Egg marrying Daenerys that this created issues. 2 royal matches being denied to the realm undoubtedly would. That it left him. Rosieri and Viserys, as the ones most would seek out, was only made truer because of it. He is second in line for the throne, also made him a more valuable match than even his sister or uncle. So despite his feelings, despite the fact that he felt politically it was the best match available to him and his family, he'd waited and hoped that his father wouldn't decide that he needed to marry another. Jay wanting to be loyal but not sure if he'd been asked that he could have been able to take anyone other than Margaery for his wife. "Yahtzee ass," his father said, his voice a little concerned, and Jay turned to see that Margaery looked to be on the verge of tears. "Forgive me, father. My happiness knows no bounds. I've wished for this for so long that He stumbled over his words and moved to Marguerite. Seeing the tears that now fell were tears of joy and not those of worry or sadness that had been threatening to fall just moments before. He took a knee and reached out and took her hands in his own, the rest of the people in the room fading away as he looked into her eyes. "Well, I love you, Marguerite, more than anything in this world. I love you. I always have, and I'm so very happy that you're to be my wife," he said, smiling up at her as he knelt in front of her. "And you," Jay, she said shakily. I love you. Always, she added a little later, when she composed herself. After they had spoken for a few moments, Marguerite was asked to join with him and his family as they walked to the throne room for the night's feast. Ostensibly, the feast was in celebration of his name day and partly his victory in the joust. But now it had taken on a completely different meaning. His betrothal was to be announced, and he was to be officially named as the Prince of Summerhall. He quickly told Reimagined and then went to speak to Viserys. His own betrothal had somewhat paved the way for his after all. Thanking his uncle, he moved back and took Margaery's arm in his own as they were introduced and walked into the throne room together. Jay knew it was perfectly clear now to everyone the betrothal was coming, just as for years his feelings for her had been well known to all. He looked out to see if any seemed surprised, annoyed, or upset by her placement at the high table and was relieved to find there didn't seem to be anyone that was. They ate, and he sent dishes to tables and nods to those who received them. Once done, he got gifts from his family, from friends, and from Marguerite herself. Though he barely saw any of them, and none could match the gift his father had given him earlier that night. When his father stood up and made the duel announcement, Jane was happy to hear those present clap and cheer, and happier still a few moments later when the dancing began. He reached out to take her hand and led her out onto the floor, finding himself keen both to hold her in his arms and to speak to her without anyone else listening in. Jay needing to find out how she was truly feeling about everything that had occurred. You are happy with this, with us? He asked as they began to move, a slight note of worry in his voice. More than happy, she said to his relief. When Father told us, I got so lost in the thoughts of what it would mean, that what I wished for more than anything in this world was to come true, that's why I hesitated. Marge, he said, looking into her eyes. I know, for a moment I thought, she said, her voice trailing off. But I know how you feel about me. Jay, I feel it too for you. I love you. I have from the first moment I saw you, she said, smiling at him. Really? That gangly boy who could barely speak to you? He said with a chuckle. That boy who looked at me like no one ever has, who took the time to get to know me and share my interests, who each day I've only fallen more and more in love with, she said. He leaned in and kissed her. Damn protocol, or what anyone may think. Jay, feeling her lips on his as he began to imagine the future they'd have together. The nudge in his ribs came from behind him, and he turned to see Reimagined dancing close to them, his sister having been the one to stop the kiss. Lord Mace and Lady Olenna are watching you, brother, and neither looks best pleased. Rosier whispered, and Jay glanced at their table, seeing that she was right. We're to be wed, Ray. Let them look, he said, receiving a smile from Marjorie in return. They were big words he spoke, and he knew that despite them he'd not kiss her again, so publicly. He'd found favor with the Tyrells because he'd acted honorably regardless of how he felt, and he'd not act dishonorably now. So after a couple of more dances with Marguerite and one each with Ray and Dany, Jay walked from the room to get some fresh air, only to see her once again. The woman walked ahead of him with the White Wolf by her side, and then she turned and looked at him before smiling and beckoning him forward. Jay! He thought he heard a voice call out from behind him as he moved to follow, and when he looked back, he saw Marguerite standing with Ray. Both of them were beckoning him towards them, while ahead of him, the woman was doing likewise. Jay saw her face clearly then, her dark gray eyes and dark brown hair. There was a certain wildness about them that he felt to be familiar. He turned back to see Marguerite was holding out her hand, her fingers moving as she bid him her way, and then he turned to see the White Wolf had turned its head also. Its deep red eyes were looking so intently at him that Jay felt it was looking deep into his very soul, and so he began to move towards him, and the woman and further away from those fend him. King's Landing 2098 AC. Marguerite. Each day he didn't wake increased her worry, and were it not for the fact that her family, Jack's family and Ghost, were there with her then, she'd have probably lost her mind by now. She woke up each morning and immediately checked to see if there had been any change, only to find herself disappointed each time. Marguerite had felt something different when Ned Stark came to speak to him, listening in as he told tales of Jake's mother, and though there was no movement or obvious change, she'd felt something had happened. It had given her hope that he'd wake that first night, so much so that after kissing him goodnight and telling him that she loved him, she laid his clothes out for him to wear the next morning, only to once again wake and find there was no change, and Jack was still not waking. Her mother and grandmother would come and sit with her from time to time, both of them doing their best to comfort her, and her grandmother would even sit by the bed and speak to Jack. Margaery listening as she would tell him what was going on in the realm. Lords too would spend almost as much time with her and Jay as he did on duty. As soon as he was done, he would come into the room and take a seat to speak to them both, while Margaery lay in the bed holding her husband's hand. Her brother had a knack for being able to hold a conversation with Jay as if he was getting answers or responses to the things he said. So much so that at times Margaery looked and almost expected Jay to be sitting up and awake. When she did leave the room, which was as little as possible, it was to inform others of Jaxley's progress or lack of it. Margaery taking time to speak to Sansa and Arya, to Jenna and Ashara, and to Oberyn, Yaoria, and his daughters. Other than Jaime, it was perhaps Oberyn who offered her the most support, both emotionally and practically. The two of them had taken to ensure the realm was not forgotten, or the people neglected, and Oberyn's own conversations with Jay actually brought her amusement, or as much as she'd allow them to bring her. Many years ago, nephew, when I was no older than you are now, and my mother still lived, Ilya and I took a trip to Hellholt. It was the first time I ever saw Elia, and looking back upon it now, I find myself thinking what a fool I was. I'd not yet truly, how shall I put it, spread my seed, Oberyn said. Margaery sat with a small grin on her face. Whether it was the northerner in Jack, or that he'd grown up surrounded by strong women, her husband always blushed when someone else spoke of sex. He was no prude, far from it, and when they were alone his tongue could be wicked both in its words and its deeds. But someone speaking of sex in front of him, especially in her presence, and her husband would turn a shade of red that she found most becoming. Ellaria was as beautiful then as she is now. You know what I mean, nephew? You found your own beauty, and once you have, then none other will ever compare. Oberyn said, looking over at her, causing her to blush a little. But I was a foolish boy, nephew, a foolish boy who thought he knew better, and so, while her beauty attracted me, I did nothing. And it was many years later when we finally were joined together. She looked on as Oberyn seemed to almost drift off for a moment, his eyes looking off somewhere in the distance, and she wondered if he was remembering Ellaria then, or the day he spoke of. Only to find out it was only partly both. Jaxlia, though Jay, your aunt, she knew it from the moment she looked at me. She knew it, she called me out on it, called me a fool to my face, and I proved her right by not listening to her. Margaery heard the chuckle that came from Oberyn and felt him move closer to the bed, his hand touching Jane's face so softly that she thought her husband would feel as if a soft breeze was blowing. I have lost too much of my family, nephew. I will lose no more. My niece and your uncle are to wed, and both Arianne and Tyrion will wish you there. I wish you there. My daughters wish to grow up and become the desert roses that their cousin named them, and for him to see them become so. And Illyria and I, Jag, thanks to you we can wed, we can do something that was I. I'm more of a man I'd have done so many years ago. Thanks to you, I can finally call her my wife and no longer my paramour. I need you there. Illyria needs you there. Do not disappoint me. Or your aunt. Come back to us. Come back to your wife, Jag Arian. She had gone to speak to Ellaria to find it true, the woman both overjoyed and worried at the same time. Oberyn had apparently asked her not long after her one and only visit to see Jay. Ellaria, not having reacted well to seeing him lying in the bed, so why that was Margaery was unsure, but it had convinced her that she was right not to allow the children to see him in such a state. It was hard enough seeing the looks of worry and concern in the eyes of those old enough to understand. She didn't think she could bear to see something similar in Sansa or Arya's eyes, and she knew that she could not enjoy. Other than the children, it was the dragons whose reaction worried her most. Rhaenys most of all, and were it not for Ghost, then she'd have worried what Jack Soster would have done by now. The other four dragons, even Lygaron, thanks to Tyrion, seemed to have calmed. Rhaenys without Jack had very much not. Her wings could be heard as she feel over the Red Keep each day. Margaery, knowing that people looked to the sky and watched the white dragon as she circled Maegor's holdfast. At night, the noises she made would resonate through the walls of the Red Keep itself, sounds of anger, of pain, and of sadness. Ghost would get up from the bed and Margaery would let him out. Jaime told her that the White Wolf would head to the dragon pit and Rhaenys would follow and meet him there. When morning arrived, she'd find Ghost was back at her door, and Rhaenys to be flying over the Red Keep once more. The routine never changing until tonight, when instead of heading for the door, Ghost moved to the balcony and looked at her before grabbing onto her sleeve to drag her towards it. "Ghost, no," she said, shaking her hand away from her, and dislodging his grip on her. Only for the wolf to grab her once more, the look in his red eyes, one she felt was almost begging her to follow. Reluctantly, she did so. walking with the wolf to the balcony and looking out on the early evening's fading light. She almost jumped back when Rhaenyra flew so close to the balcony that the wind from her wings caused her to close her eyes, Marguerite opening them when the dragon had passed, only for Rhaenyra to fly back a few moments later and do the same. This time she was more prepared, though, and she kept her eyes open, soon finding them looking into the deep purple of Rhaenyra's own as she passed by. On and on this went, and for how long she knew not. At one point she reached out and with a little bit of stretching touched the dragon's scales. All the while Rhaenyra would look at her and Ghost at them both, all three of them somehow sharing their concerns with each other. As the light faded away, Ghost turned and walked inside, and Rhaenyra flew by one last time before she headed off to what Marguerite assumed was the dragon pit. She stayed on the balcony for just a few moments longer, feeling a sense of sadness come over her as she thought about the white dragon. She could at least touch Ye. Rhaenyra hadn't seen or felt her brother in almost 2 weeks, and Marguerite wondered if there was something that could be done to rectify that. The voice startled her, and she ran into the room and readied to call for the guards, only to see who it was who was speaking before she did so. How she'd gotten in here was beyond her, and it was something that would need to be addressed. Marguerite knowing that there was no way the Kingsguard had left the door unguarded with she and Jay inside. Just as she was about to make her presence felt, though she heard the words that Joy spoke, and it caused her to stop and listen, rather than make it clear that she was there. Apples misses you, Jon, Winter too. We were supposed to have our ride, remember. Balin too, he led me to you. They wouldn't let me see you, but I knew you'd want me to come. They left you alone. I'd never leave you alone. They wouldn't let me see you. Jon, and when I did come, I find you're alone. You want me to tell you a story? Once upon a time, in a castle far, far away, there lived a little girl named Joy. She was all alone, until one day, Marguerite listened as Joy told a story that she was certain was a different version of the one J-Tier told the girl many times. A tale of a beautiful young girl who could ride like the wind, and of the boy who was her brother. She felt the tears falling down her cheeks, both from the thoughts of how much it was apparent that Joy had truly needed to see Jay, and that she'd kept her away from him. Wiping her eyes, she moved into the room and lay down on the bed beside them both. Joy realizing that Jay hadn't been alone and giving her a small smile as she continued to tell her story. Beyond the wall, 2098 AC, Bloodraven. A mind was a wondrous thing, and the boy's mind only proved this more than any. Brynden feeling the power that resonated within him and his own power, almost feeling inconsequential next to it. That he'd only begun to tap into it both scared and excited him as he began to wonder just what he could do with this power. When he added it to his knowledge, for now, though, he couldn't access it and could only witness it instead. He watched as the boy warged first without knowing what he was doing. Then as he learned, and then when he unleashed the full extent of that power, both unwillingly and then willingly. Brynden saw the dragons being born and a use of magic that he'd never been able to master. He'd seen it before, of course, saw dragons born, and had seen them die, but never had he seen it so, and never had he felt the magic required to make it so. When he saw how easily the boy lit the glass candles, how he, in far less time than Brynden had mastered the present and the past with them, he felt relieved that he'd not yet mastered the future. As he felt him warg into people, first the giant boy, who was supposed to hold the door so he could escape, then the giant monster, and then the 2 Dornishmen, each time using different forces as again he did so willingly and unwillingly, he was amazed. Controlled and uncontrolled, the power of each staggered his mind, though it was nothing compared to the controlled power the boy used on the woman. Even he had not yet mastered being able to manipulate dreams, so Brynden was almost using a blunt tourney sword, while the boy used Dark Sister, his cuts running far deeper than Brendan's ever had. For all he could see, though, there were things that the boy blocked from him, hidden things which only made Brynden keener to get to them. The boy's dreams were of nameless, faceless shadows, much to Brendan's annoyance. No matter how hard he tried, he was unable to see them. He did see the book, the one he'd always known where it was, but the one he had never been able to get close to. Brynden saw it. Saw the room at Dragonstone easily open to the boy, where it would not to him. And as he tempered his jealousy over that, he found that his annoyance at not being able to see what was written within it only rose ever higher. He felt it then, a tapping on the wall, a brick coming loose, and then another, and so he left this part of the boy's mind alone and moved quickly to the prison instead. It was odd, this sense of panic, this worry which threatened to overtake him. 4 times in his life he'd felt it. The first time was in Redgrass Field, when his brother had almost taken his life. Brynden had felt it again when he'd lost his love, and finally realized that this time it was for true, and then again, but a few years ago, when a white dragon had chased him from Winterfell and had forced him back beyond the wall. It was an even more urgent feeling now, and as he moved, he soon found that the wall was crumbling. The prison he'd so painstakingly built was beginning to fall. He ran and knew he was going to be too late, and then he began to hear the words before he got there. He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past. And you control neither. I'm coming for you, uncle. I'm coming for you, and I bring you only fire and blood. Jaxra said, and Brynden turned to run away. King's Landing, 288. Jorny, holding meetings, answering questions that he knew not the answer to, and seeing the looks on people's faces as they met with him, rather than the king or queen, was not how he'd envisioned his days. That he was apparently doing a decent enough job of it didn't make him feel any better about it either. Jackmate doing what he must, rather than what he wished to do, and were it not for Daisy and Joanna, for Janna, and surprisingly for Oberyn Martell, he didn't know if he'd have been able to. Every instinct in him wished him to be by Jane's side, and yet he knew he could not do so, and was as needed as much, if not more, here as he was there. The realm needed stability, and though he wanted to spend his days with the boy he thought of as his son, it was up to him to provide that stability. So once again, he woke early and kissed his wife on the lips and on her swollen belly before walking into Joanna's room and kissing her forehead as she slept. Yoma cursing that he needed to rise before them, and yet just as he had for the last 2 weeks, he did just that. After he dressed, he made his way to his solar and began the painstaking process of writing out missives and orders, all so that the simple day-to-day business of the realm could carry on without stoppages or delays. Daisy arrived to order him to lunch, just as she had each day for this past week. Jaime finding that his appetite was both ravenous and non-existent at times, as his worries for Jats increased each day that he didn't wake up. He'd been certain he would have by now, so much so that he had no difficulty, at least early on, in reassuring Marjorie that all would be well. Something that was now getting harder and harder for any of them to do. "Come eat," Daisy said, and he nodded as he left the last of the papers unsigned and followed her to their small dining room. Looking at Joanna smile happily at him as they ate at their small table gave him temporary respite from his troubled thoughts. As did watching Daisy eat in the least ladylike manner possible, his wife's hunger knowing few bounds, and Jaime believing like her mother did, that it truly was a bear she carried. When he would stop and not eat as he sat with them, Joanna would reach out and take something from her own plate and hold it up to him. His daughter, just like her mother, wouldn't let him go hungry. "Eat, Popeye," Joanna said. And while the piece of cheese she held didn't look very appetizing to him, just looking at his daughter, he knew he was lost and could refuse her nothing. "Thank you, little cub," he said, and was rewarded with the brightest smile he'd ever seen. His daughter's was one that could make him move the very mountains themselves, he'd always thought. "More, Papa?" Joanna asked. "Aye, more," he said before he lifted her from her seat and began blowing on her neck. Joanna's laughter like a balm to his soul. They ate and played, or truth be told, played far more than they ate, and then Ciar came to take his daughter to her lessons. Jaime kissing her cheeks repeated while she laughed, and then allowing the servant to take her from him. "You spoil her." Daisy said, still eating, "I'm a Lannister, the head of the wealthiest house in Westeros and hand of the king. If I can't spoil our daughter, then who can?" He asked and saw Daisy's small smirk. "True enough. Have you much more to do today?" Daisy asked. "Petitions and a small council meeting." "And Jay?" she asked, looking at him. "And Jay," he said. After he finished his food and took a large swallow of the warmed milk, he walked over and kissed his wife once more, his hand automatically going to her belly and rubbing it before he moved away from her. Bidding her farewell for now, he headed to the throne room to hear the petitions, and for the next few hours he did just that. Jaime sighing when it was clear that word was beginning to spread about the king's illness and the queen's reluctance to leave his side. When he was done, he headed straight to the small council chambers, finding Oberyn and Olenna to be the only ones inside. Jaime cursing himself for forgetting that Sir Richard had left to travel to Braavos with Willis and Wyman. Had he remembered that and the fact that Lord Montford was readying the fleet to take Asha Greyjoy to the Iron Islands, then he'd have held this meeting in his solar rather than at the large table with just he, Olenna, and Oberyn present. "The very small council," Oberyn said with a chuckle as Jaime took his seat. "Indeed," he said. "Is there actually much that we need to discuss?" Olenna asked. Nothing of any great import, though I wish Sir Richard was here, he said, looking at them both. People are beginning to speak? Oberyn asked. Questions are being raised. The lords and ladies we can deal with. The small folk, though, he left the rest unsaid. Sir Richard's men. Perhaps they can be used. Olenna said, the Red Priest, too. Oberyn said, catching him by surprise. The Red Priests, he asked. Thoros and Lady Melisandre, they've gathered quite a following. People have even begun work converting one of the warehouses down on the docks into a temple, Oberyn said. Since when? He asked, stunned. From as soon as Lady Melisandre arrived from Dragonstone. Jaeger promised her that he'd allow them the freedom to teach their religion as long as they followed certain rules, and word has spread that they helped our king while he was hidden. Oberyn said, Word spread by them, no doubt. Olenna said, annoyed. Word spread all the same, Olenna, Oberyn said. Sir Richard's men, he asked, looking to Olenna. Sir Jareth, I believe, is the main one. Though given how secretive the Order of Skulls and Kisses is, that may just be what they wish me to believe. Olenna said with a smirk. I can trust you to speak to him then, Lady Olenna, he asked, and she nodded. And you the Red Priests, Oberyn? You can. What it is you wish of them. Oberyn asked. Have them let it be known that Jaxley is recovering and that this is not something they need to be overly concerned about. Let them know that both the King and Queen will soon be appearing to speak to them, and that their absence is because of them being newlywed, Jaime said. And we're sure they both will be returning to their duties soon. Oberyn asked concernedly. We can hope, he said, seeing the nods from both of them. They discussed other considerations of the realm. Jaime telling them that he'd received the raven from the Vale, and that Harold Harding was on his way to swear his fealty, and Olenna, asking about Catelyn Tully, only for Jaime to shake his head and refuse to speak on her. Jave would deal with her when he awoke, and it would be to the lady's benefit that it was him that did so. Were it left to any of them in this room, then Catelyn Tully wouldn't live for long, and Oberyn had already suggested many ways of seeing to her end. From now on, we'll speak in one of our solars until the others have returned. Jaime said, and the Solid on the letter and both agreed, before he turned to walk from the room, leaving them both sitting there and speaking to each other. He was heading to Jake's rooms when he was asked to go to meet with his aunt. Jaime's wondering what it was that she wished to speak to him about, and knowing now that he'd be back with Daisy and Joanna much later than he had hoped to be. Jaina had taken over the running of the Red Keep itself, the household, the stores, the servants, and stewards all answering to her so as to remove those duties from Marguerite's shoulders. As he reached her door, he hoped that it was those she wished to speak to him on, but he knew it would not be. You wish to see me, he said as he walked into the room. Jenna sitting at her desk, filling out countless papers. I do. You heard what your cousin did, she asked with a soft smile on her face. No, wait, which cousin? He asked as he took a seat. Joy, of course. Apparently she found a way into Jay and Marguerite's rooms. The Queen returned from the balcony and found her lying in her bed speaking to Jay. Jay said, her smile fuller now. The little minx, he said with a chuckle. Wait, when was this? Last night. I collected her this morning, and Marguerite has agreed to let her come back during the day and later tonight. Jenna said, and Jaime nodded. And that's what you wish to speak to me about? No, that's just something I wish to tell you. What I want to speak on is the trout. His aunt said, her voice and face much different now, and Jaime could see the humor that had been clear in Nia was now completely gone. Will be dealt with when Jay awakens, he said. I wish to speak to her. Tata said. Aunt, I won't harm her, not physically, though it will take all I have in me not to. I wish to speak to her, Jaime. See it done. I don't know if that's such a good idea, he said, looking at her and shaking his head. I don't care. See it done, she said, almost dismissively. He sat there for a few moments thinking it over, knowing that his aunt wished to give Catelyn Tully a piece of her mind and that she was not alone in this. Daisy Ashara, Olenna, and were it not for Jaya's condition, he suspected even Marjorie herself would all wish to do likewise. After a moment's thought, he began to think it wasn't such a bad idea. After all, the woman deserved to be spoken down to, and there was no one more qualified to do so than Jaina. Very well, I'll arrange it for the morrow, he said, rising from his seat. Thank you, his aunt said softly. As he was walking to the door, he heard her cough, and he turned back to look at her. Jenna staring at him as if she was about to say something, and then, just when he thought she would not, she did. Give him, my love, Jaime, she said as she lowered her head. Her voice soft, and Jaime said he would before he left to go and sit with Jay for a little bit before he would head back to his rooms. King's Landing 2098 AC. Sancha. None of them had been allowed to see him. Not her, not Arya or Robb, Martin, Willem, or Joy. None of the children had been allowed inside, and despite the many protests she made, the angry ones that Arya had, or the more reasoned ones that Robb put forth, her father and the others wouldn't relent. Each day they were simply told that he was recovering, and they'd see him soon, and Sansa felt it to be true. Telling both Arya and Robb of how it was when he'd fallen in the Riverlands, and how for days on end she'd sat by his bed and just watched him sleep. She told them that it had seemed as if he'd never wake up, but that after almost 2 weeks, Jon had in his recovery afterward was total and complete. It didn't reassure them or her as much as she hoped, and Sansa found she missed not having Willas by her side to offer her the same reassurances. Each day that passed only made her worries rise and Arya act out more and more, not even their father's threats of discipline calming her sister's anger. If it hadn't been for the wolves, then she doubted anything could have. Fang, Nymeria, and Grey Wind all refusing to leave their sides for more than a few moments at a time, and Sansa grateful for that and for the ability to get lost in her wolf's mind as well. She'd found that when she did so, her worries reduced somewhat, and whether it was that Fang didn't worry in the same way as she did or that the wolf knew more than her, she couldn't be sure. What she was sure of, though, was that it allowed her to think that Jon would recover, and that, despite it taking longer for him to do so, it didn't mean what she believed it to. Whatever it was that was going on with her brother was something that he needed to do, and so she'd choose to believe that, and to share it with both Robb and Arya. Jon is fighting, Arya. It's a fight we can't take part in, but it's a fight he will win, she said, as they all sat in her room. How do you know? How could you? You've not seen him. None of us has. Arya said her anger is always tinged with the worry she felt. The wolves know, Arya. Jon told me that many years ago. They know more than we, and we need to trust that they're right, now and always. I don't understand, Robb said, looking her way. Sansa did her very best to explain it, how she'd been in Fang and how it had felt, and that she was certain that she was right. Both Robb and Arya, making her doubt it, though, when they said that perhaps she was believing what she wished to, and not what was the truth. So she did the only thing she knew to do. She told them to warg and to see it for themselves. Robb got up and locked the door. Even though most near them knew of their warging, they decided it was for the best, if they kept it to those who understood. Sansa, having remembered the conversation she'd had with Lady Olenna when she'd explained what it was like to warg and the advice the woman had given her. The Faith would not think so highly on this, the Citadel either. The North is already thought of disparagingly by some in the South. I too felt that way at one time. Olenna said, looking at her, "You think I should keep it to myself?" she asked. "It's for the best that you do, Sansa. Besides, some secrets are fun to keep. Are they not?" Willis had told her likewise, as had Jon, who'd also explained that his family had always been looked warily upon because of the dragons, and it had led some to lash out at them or thinking them to be against the nature of the gods. Wargs may be a known thing, Sansa, in the North and in books, but it's one thing to know of them and another to see them prove true. There are those in the realm who fear magic and would seek to harm those who possess it. And trust me, little sister, it's magic that we possess. So for now, at least it was best it was kept secret. And once Robb had locked the door and returned to his seat, she, her brother and sister, closed their eyes and were soon in their wolves. She lay on the ground, her wild sister and swift brother beside her. Their quiet brother lay beside his 2-foot, while mother followed after her own. The fierce brother sat by a fire and chewed on a bone, his 2-foot speaking to him as he brushed his coat. Far away in the north, their wise brother ran free through the woods, and she could almost sense the beating of his heart as he engaged in the hunt. Looking to her wild sister and swift brother, she saw they felt it too, the presence that was coming their way and getting ever closer. She could feel their excitement when they realized who it was, and she wondered if mother knew father was on the way. Her wild sister seemed upset, and so she moved to her and rubbed her head against her. The swift brother doing likewise, and she knew then it was because of the quiet brother's 2-foot. He was there but not there, here but not here. And though her wild sister and swift brother worried about him, the quiet brother did not, and so she pointed them to him. Sansa opened her eyes and saw that Arya and Robb still had theirs closed, and so she waited until they were done and had come back to themselves before she spoke. "Did you feel it?" she asked. and saw Robb nod and Arya smile a little. The first one she'd seen on her sister's face in quite a number of days. "He'll recover," Arya said. "Aye, he will. And then he'll deal with Mother," Robb said. And Sansa felt her joy at their relief soon begin to fade. Jon being ill had in some ways been a good thing, as it had allowed them to forget the fact that their mother was now here and would soon need to be dealt with. Her crimes were many and numerous, and each of them had agreed that she needed to pay for them, though all of them had different ideas of how much she needed to pay. Surprisingly, it was Arya who spoke up more for her than she or Robb did, her little sister not knowing as much about what their mother had done as either of them. Sansa was both reluctant to tell her and knew that she had needed to know the full extent of what their mother had been a part of. When Jon had told them what he planned to do, she had sat quietly and listened and had found herself at odds with him. Her mother had tried to kill him, had cost Adders his life, and had that been all, then that would have been enough. But Sansa remembered how she'd acted when she'd tried to have him killed again, what she had said and how she had behaved, and even after it all, she'd still tried to deny her brother what was his by right. She'd sat and listened and kept her own counsel, wishing for nothing more than to stand up and scream out how wrong it all was, how she didn't deserve mercy or forgiveness or a single one of their tears, and how if she'd have had her way, then they'd be mourning Jon and not worrying about her fate. She'd wished to, but she had not, and though she disagreed completely with what Jon had decided, Sansa had accepted it. He was her brother, and it was he who'd been harmed, and so it was his choice alone to make. "She's getting off easy," she said to a gasp from Arya and a worried look from Robb. "Sansa?" Robb said, looking at her. "No, Robb. What she did, what she tried to do, if it were anyone but her, then she'd lose her head. You understand that, and how this will make Jon look. She is our mother, and I loved her once. Perhaps deep down inside I love her still, but were she not, if she was someone else's, that would you worry so about her fate? But she's not someone else's mother, she's ours." Arya said, and Sansa saw her sister wipe her eye. "And she tried to harm the pack." "Yeah, she tried to kill Jon, to break the pack up," she said, looking to her sister. When they left, she knew she'd not changed their minds on their mother, though she took comfort that she'd at least managed to alleviate their concerns about Jon. Sansa lay back down on her bed and hoping that her brother would awake soon and that Wallace would return unharmed. Brevos, 2098 AC. Willis. His cane hit the ground as he moved through the city. Willis making his first visit to Braavos, as was Ser Richard, while Lord Wyman had come here many times. Both of them had been happy to find out. It had taken them 3 days to receive an audience with the Iron Bank. Willis finding himself incredibly annoyed at the wait, though Ser Richard had welcomed it, the man disappearing into the city more than once since they'd arrived. Their prisoner had behaved impeccably throughout. Willis certain it was the fact that Jade had allowed him to keep his own gold and that they were only taking the company's. Gorys still wearing an almost king's ransom in it on his person. He knew the man had tried and failed to bribe many of the guards who'd been left over him, Jay insisting that it was the men of the 100 and Sir Richard's own rather than any others who'd been handed the task. His grandmother had been affronted at the suggestion that some of their men would or could be bought for coin, until Marguerite had pointed out that in truth that was what they had done to them in the first place. But once he'd realized he couldn't escape, then Gorys had just welcomed his good fortune and good treatment. The man had eaten and drunk far better than all but the noblest of their prisoners. Now, though, he was being led into the Iron Bank's building, and Wellis felt nervous about it, and about how the bankers may react to him. Given the sheer amount of coin the man was in control of, what was to stop him from turning them to his side? It was a question he'd pondered, and one which Sir Richard had provided the answer to. One single word making everything clear. Dragons. Relax, they're just bankers, Wyman said, sensing his nervousness as they entered the bank's domain. That's the problem, my lord, he said, receiving a large gawk from the merman in return. Once inside the building, they were taken straight into a large room with a big, imposing desk that had 3 chairs behind it. Willis, Wyman, and Garsiderian, the only 3 from their group allowed in the room, all their guards having to wait outside. Willis felt his nerves begin to rise once more, and only relaxed when the tall, thin man walked in, carrying a number of books in his hand, and took a seat before bidding them take their own. There were a few moments of silence as the man looked at each of them before he then spoke. "And how may the Iron Bank help you today?" the thin man asked. "You know who we are?" Wyman said, while Willis gathered his wits about him. "Lord Wyman Manderley, newly appointed Master of Trade to His Grace King Jaehaerys Targaryen." Lord Willis Tyrell, newly appointed Master of Coin to the same King Angoras Idarayan, Paymaster General of the now not-so-golden company. The man said, and though the last part could have been a jate, his voice had not changed at all. "And you are?" Willis asked. "Nofo Dimitis." "First things first, Goritz, if you will," Willis said, finally, feeling ready to take charge. "As you are no doubt aware, the Golden Company keeps a large account here with the Iron Bank, and I, as Paymaster General, have control over that account. Do I not?" Gorios asked. "You are correct. As a result of my agreement with His Grace, I've come here to sign that account over to Lord Willis and the Crown." Gort said. "The entire account?" Noho asked, surprised. "The entire account," Gorios said. "Which stands out?" Willis asked. He watched as Noho opened one of the books and began skimming over pages until finally stopping and looking at it intently before picking up a quill and scribbling down some figures on a small piece of paper. "In Westerosi, 3,774,604 gold dragons," Noho said, and Willis looked to Wyman, who was smiling at hearing the amount. "And what is needed to bring this account under our control?" he asked. "A signature from Goras Adrian will suffice," Noah said. "Once he signs, he cannot gain access to it from that point," he asked, looking at both the banker and the red-haired Goras. "He cannot," Noah said. "And as per my agreement with His Grace, I'm free to go my way?" Goras said, and Willis nodded. It took a few moments for the papers to be drawn up, and Goras signed them immediately. Willis then watching as 2 guards came in to remove him from the building, the man's business ties to the Iron Bank now terminated, and his presence no longer welcome. As soon as he was gone, Nofo turned to both him and to Wyman with a smile now on his face. "And how can the Iron Bank be of service to the Crown?" Noah asked. Willis spoke to the man about the Crown's debt, finding out that it was a little over 500,000, which left them with more than 3 million gold dragons and put the Crown in the most favorable position it had been in for years. He knew that they owed the Lannisters close to 1 million and his own family almost as much, but even were they to pay them both off immediately, which they would not, they'd still have over 1 million gold dragons in the accounts. After receiving notes of credit and making himself a signatory on the account, he waited while Wyman was taken into another room. The Lord of White Harbor coming back far too soon for him to have done any business, and Willis finding out as they walked back to their manse that he would need to return on the morrow. Sacha Richard was nowhere to be seen when they returned, and Willis could only hope the man's business wouldn't take too long. He was more than eager to return to King's Landing as soon as possible. "You think we'll be departing soon?" he asked Wyman as they sat down to eat later that night. "Before week's end, I'd imagine. My own business should be concluded on the morrow, with any luck. And as for Sir Richard," Wyman said with a shrug, "do you have any idea why he's with us? I mean, other than that vagueness about getting a present for the king," he asked. "No, the man holds to his secrets as a maiden does her modesty," Wyman said, and Willis chuckled. "The trade, what His Grace suggested, you think it beneficial?" he asked. "Most beneficial, the routes alone will earn us coin, and should we expand as much as I hope, the possibilities are endless." Wyman said, smiling. He was about to ask more about it when he heard the whistle and then the footsteps and looked up to Sarah, Richard almost strolling into the room. The Master of Whisperers taking a seat and reaching out to pour himself some of the peach brandy before sipping it and then swallowing it down, only to refill his glass and sit back in his seat. "A good day?" he asked curiously. "Most good, I found a king's present," Richard said with a large smile on his face. "So after Lord Wyman finishes his business, we can leave?" he asked. "After that, and I find a cage fit to hold a slippery bird," Richard said before laughing. "A very slippery bird indeed." King's Landing, 298 AC. Dany, seeing her nephew lay so still, was disheartening, and not something she enjoyed, nor was she able to put on as straight a face as Tyrion or Aemon were. Jaehaerys had not been allowed to visit Jaehaerys at all, and though Dany felt for her aunt, she could understand it. Tyrion having told her what had occurred, and while she didn't blame her for it, she had found she was in the minority on that. Jaehaerys, though perhaps blamed herself far more than anyone other than perhaps the Queen did. Her aunt had gone into her shell, almost, and barely left her room, other than to go to Aemon's. As for her uncle, he'd spent days going over books, and had found nothing. Dany having walked in on him more than once looking at a strange book with barely any writing in it, when she'd asked him about it, he'd told her that it was a book of many names, some calling it signs and portents, and others Daenerys' journal. Both she and Tyrion had been most eager to read it once he'd confirmed that it was indeed the book the dreamer wrote. Both of them disappointed to find that it contained very few actual words other than what seemed to be the secret to hatching dragon's eggs. "This is different than how my own children were born," she said, as Tyrion and Shiera all sat in Ammon's room, her aunt and uncle having asked them both to join them. "How so?" Ammon asked curiously. "I used wildfire," she said, to a shocked look from Tyrion. "Why?" her brother asked. "It was what the vision showed me. I fired an arrow and set it on fire and then had to walk into it. I even lost my hair because of it," she said, looking to her aunt to confirm it. And finding she was looking off into the distance. "You were bald?" Tyrion asked, smirking. "A baldy fucker, Sandor called me," she said, and her brother started laughing, as did she. When they stopped, she handed the book back to Egwene and Tyrion, asked him more about it, Egwene not having any answers as to why there were no more words in it than the ones they could see. "It's so, he can't see them," Shiera said. Dany looked to her as her aunt spoke the first words she had since they'd arrived in the room. "Who?" Tyrion asked. "Bloodraven," Aemon said, bidding them both to come closer. "While I've not been able to actually find a way to help Jaehaerys, none of us truly can." Aen said, and she looked worriedly at Tyrion. "I've instead been reading up on our uncle, though not even the books know him as well as Shiera does." Daenerys looked to her aunt, who seemed almost resigned to speaking about a man she knew had been her love once. Rhaegar having only briefly mentioned him to her while they were together in Essos, yet the truth of how she'd felt about him was very clear to her. Brynden and I were fascinated by magic. What it could do, what it could be used for, the limits of knowledge notwithstanding, of course. We read all we could, looked where we could, and given Brynden's gifts, soon found more than perhaps any had before us, or at least any since the Doom. Shiera said. "Gifts?" Tyrion asked. "Brynden, just like Jay, was a warg, a powerful one. I believe it's in the blood, just as we are connected to dragons because of Valyria. Brynden is connected to the old magic because his family were of the first men." Shiera said. "I don't understand," Jane said, looking to her uncle. "We believe that magic knows magic, Dany. It seeks it out, the blood itself searching for it and looking to join it with its own. The dragons are magical creatures, and while they existed, magic existed, but once they died out, so did it." Aemon said. "Magic was gone," Tyrion said, and Aemon nodded. "But the blood remained, and it sought to find more magic, called out for it, and while some later tried to bring the dragons back, others took a different route." Aemon said. She looked at her uncle and her aunt, both of them speaking of magic as if it was a living, breathing thing, and she found herself to be lost once more. "My father sought to bring magic back. Oh, that wasn't the only reason he lay with so many women, but it was a reason all the same. His blood compelled him to seek out other magical blood, to restore what was lost when the dragons went away. My mother and Brynden's both had magic in their own blood, and my father was drawn to it," Shiera said. "What does this have to do with Jay?" Tyrion asked. "Magic has a price, a cost. One we're not certain of the true extent of. Shiera believes it led Bloodraven down a dark path, that he sought more and more of it, and the more he gained, the more powerful he became, and the more afraid." Arden said. "Afraid? Why would he be afraid if he has so much power?" Jaime asked, confused. "Because no matter how much you possess, there is always one who has more, one who is stronger than you, or more skilled, or more handsome, or beautiful, one who has what you have not. And while in life this can manifest itself in more ways than one, in magic it's far more simple," Shiera said. "There is something else too," Aemon said. "What?" Tyrion said. "For everything, there is an opposite, day and night, good and evil, beautiful and ugly," Aemon said. "Light and dark," Shiera said, looking at her. Jaime looked to Tyrion, who seemed just as lost as she. The things her aunt and uncle were saying made no sense, and yet in some ways they did too. "Bloodraven is dark?" she asked. Yet she received no confirmation or answer, only Aemon telling her that Bloodraven and Jax were on opposite sides of things, that they were bound to fight against each other, and that only one of them would survive that fight. Whomever it was would then find that fight was only the beginning of what needed to be done. She left the room far more confused than she had when she had entered it. Dany then making her way to her nephews, and finding both Margaery and the young girl Joy were on the bed laying by his side. She didn't stay long or disturb them too much, but she reached out her hand and took his own and held it for a few moments as she spoke to him. Dany telling him that she missed him and asking him to come back, that they needed him here for what was to come. The last part she said quietly in her mind and didn't speak aloud before she kissed his cheek and walked from the room. As she slept later on that night, she dreamt of a lone red eye and silver hair, and she woke up shivering as she swore that she heard a man's laugh ring out across the night. King's Landing, 2098 AC. Jaina. She had thrown herself into her duties, taking over the running of the Red Keep and the household so that Margaery had one less thing to worry about. It was not a selfless act on her part, if the truth was told, Jaina finding she needed to keep busy so she didn't worry too much. It was something that came upon her more when she was idle, the worry and concern, the thoughts that Jane may not wake up, or that even worse may occur. Try as she might, she couldn't stop her mind from going to the darkest places, finding that the words of comfort she used with the children or with Margaery herself were words spoken, and yet not words she truly believed. Or to be more precise, words that she believed less and less each day he didn't wake. Jaina had done her best to stay positive, especially around the children, Willem, Teeb, and Walder all showing their worry, as did Tommen each and every day. Yet it was Martin and Joy who were taking it the worst of all. The latter no great surprise, but the former had been, or was to her at least. Kevin and Dorna and even Lancel had expected it, as Martin idolized Jay. Gwychagana listening as her brother told her that her nephew wished to be as much like him as he could be, and it was why he practiced so. But while Martin showed his concern with periods of quietness and distracted thoughts, Joy handled her own, exactly how she'd expected. Her niece was willful, angry, uncooperative, and unwilling to listen, and Jenna, despite her frustration with her, couldn't fault her in the very least. She'd not agreed with the children being denied the chance to see him, had felt it would have been better for them all, and Jay, perhaps most of all, to allow them into the room, but she'd been overruled. So when she'd found out that Joy had found a way, that her clever little niece had not taken no for an answer, it had made her laugh out loud for the first time in almost a moon. She'd been happy when Margie had allowed Joy to come and go as she pleased, and had sworn that she'd seen a change in Jan each time the girl was near. Though perhaps that was her hope and not the truth of things. As the days went by with no change, her mind went elsewhere, until finally she could put it off no longer, and so she demanded, and was given the chance to go and speak with the Trout. Jaime giving in after she'd made it clear it wasn't a request, and now she walked down the halls and across the yard before heading down to the cells and the woman housed within. Her guards walked with her, and soon enough she was stood outside the woman's cell. Janet annoyed to see it was not the black ones where she belonged that they'd sent her to. 5 minutes, the jailer said, and she shook her head. I'll take as long as I wish. You have a problem with that, then go speak to the Lord Hand, she said as he opened the door and led her inside. The woman looked far older than her years, her face more drawn and haggard than Jenna had expected, and it reminded her more of her crazy sister than herself. She looked as if she hadn't slept a true night's sleep in some time, and yet, despite it, she was alert, and she saw how her eyes narrowed and her lips tightened when Catelyn saw her. Janna noticed how she took in her crimson and gold, and any attempt at the pretense that she'd have made to be anyone else would no doubt fail. Not that she had intended to be anyone but herself here today. I expected more. Jenna said dismissively as she gave Catelyn Tully the once-over. How dare you, Catelyn replied, and Jenna was glad to see that her pride still remained. I dare, because unlike you, I've kept my wits. I wasn't fool enough to pull on the dragon's tail, nor was I hypocrite enough to claim myself to be a woman of faith. I am a woman of faith, Catelyn said loudly. Really? You think the mother will forgive you for trying to kill a child? A bastard, Cat said loudly. No, Trout. I'm afraid you're very much mistaken. Even your true and pious High Septon accepts the truth of his birth. Not that it matters. A child is a child, and all are innocent in the eyes of the mother. Or did your Septon not teach you that? He posed a risk to my house, Cat said. Did he indeed? The very house that's in the best position it's been in since it wore a crown itself. Or perhaps you mean the house of fish that you come from, and if so, then it was you and the other little trouts that posed the true threat to that one. He wanted to usurp my son, Cat said, looking at her. You truly are a fool. It's no wonder that Brandon Stark had no wish to marry you, or that Eddard couldn't wait to set you aside, she said with a smile. You lie, Brandon loved me. And yet he married another, had a child with another who usurped, who Lady Fish. Jaina said, the boy, it was all the boy. The boy you tried to kill, the brother you tried to take away from your children. Let me tell you about that boy, Trout. That boy is worth all your children. 100 of them. 1,000 of them. That boy has naught but kindness and compassion in him. He cares for others far more than he does himself. and puts them above his own feelings each and every time. Not for favor or as part of some plan as you would claim it so, but because it's who he is. Unlike you, Trout, that boy has a heart that's full of love, not hate, not petty jealousy and fears that have no grounding in truth. She moved closer to her, her voice now softer as she did so. I should have you dragged from here, paraded through the streets, and let the people know what you tried to do to their king. You'd see it then, Catelyn Tully. Or is it Baelish? She snorted. You'd see what they think of that boy you hate so. And trust me, the sentence they'd impose on you would be one you well deserved. I should do so, but I won't, because your fate is not mine to decide. No, it's that boy who'll judge you and find you guilty. Think on that when you sleep tonight. Or if you sleep tonight. Jaina turned to walk away and then stopped, turning back and seeing the look of abject fear that was now on Catelyn's face. Had you truly been a pious woman, a woman of faith, a woman with even an ounce of motherly love inside of you? Was that truly who you were then? You'd have seen what we all saw when we looked at Jon. You would have seen a boy that any of us would have been proud to call our own. You could have had it all. His love, his adoration, and his support had you had but 1 ounce of love inside of you. 1 ounce of kindness that you'd have been willing to show him. He'd have fought the entire world to make you happy. That's who that boy is, and that's who you tried to take away from us, and that's who I damn you for. The worst of the 7 hells awaits you, Trout, and no one has ever deserved it more. She walked out from the cell, and as the doors closed, she leaned up against the wall and tried to compose herself. Never before had she felt anger the likes of which had just came over her. Jaina looking down to see where her fingers had dug into the palms of her hand and where in 1 or 2 places they'd broken the skin. As she took a deep breath, she closed her eyes and then opened them before she began to move, and soon enough, she found herself outside the king's chambers. "How is he?" she asked as she walked in. Marguerite sitting by the bed, and Joy and Beleriand leaning against Ghost on top of it. Beyond the wall, 2098 AC. Bloodraven. He scrambled and tried to close back up the walls, fixing them 1 brick at a time, and finding almost as soon as he did so, another came crashing down. The words his kinsman had spoken had sent a shiver down his spine, and he felt a fear that he'd not felt in years. Brynden was not used to being the one who was afraid. Even seeing his enemy to the north had never made him feel this way. And as he tried desperately to keep his kinsman contained, he thought back to when he'd seen the truth of what was to come. Their house would fall, the vision had been clear enough in that, and so he'd done all he could to see that it would not come about. He'd killed his brother, though not truly with his own hands. His nephews, though he couldn't be certain it was any arrow he'd fired that had seen them fall. True enough, he tried to end Icor, but he'd been left with no choice, had he not? It had cost him an eye, and yet even that he'd seen was to come, if not quite how it was to occur. He had done it all for them, and they'd cast him aside. He'd given them his blood, his eye, his love, and they'd sent him to rot away at the end of the world. Brynden finding his bitterness rising like a fire which kept him warm from the cold. He'd wondered why he'd not seen this end, why he'd not known this was to come, and he knew then his magic was not strong enough for him to truly see. It was then the voices and the dreams came, the call from a place even further north than here, and Brynden began to make plans that he knew may never come to pass. How many years passed he could not tell, but he felt his power grow. The deal he'd made with the old god's servant was one he never intended to keep, and one which would serve him and not them. Time was like a river to him, and he'd learned how it truly ran, and once you knew where to go, how to travel along the waters, nothing stood in your way. Forward, backward, or simply standing still, he'd done it all. And then he'd seen the thing in the cold, the thing that sought his end but would never end him, and finally he saw the one who would. It was useless beyond hope. The walls were tumbling down far quicker than he could rebuild them. The prison hadn't been enough, and his kinsman was breaking free and would soon be coming for him. A destiny that he'd tried so very hard to avoid was close to being inevitable, unless he acted and acted soon. "Leaf," he called out. "Ecorn." His words drifted in the wind and none answered, and so he closed his eyes to see and saw them all sitting around a small fire that burned in the cave. Brynden opened his eyes and called out to them once more, and still the children didn't come. He needed the paste, and he needed it now, and so he reached out and called the raven to him. The sound of its wings as it flew through the cave seeming far louder than they should. It took him some time to eat enough. The raven feeding him as if he was its chick, and Brynden feeling his strength begin to grow as he closed his eyes and reached out to any who'd listen. He felt his kin, old and young, known and unknown to him. Shiera standing out like a beacon, but close to him. and there but not, and Daenerys just outside his reach. The dwarf forced him away, not allowing him even close, and he knew the one he wished for most was lost to him forever now. Not even his prison would hold him back. So Brynden took to the air once more, his ravens flying and yet not, north, south, east, and west. A small girl, an older woman, a young man, all mere flickering lights, and soon enough he was back in familiar places. 1,000 eyes in one, the voice whispered as it slept, the patch no longer on his eye and the hollow space seeming as familiar as his own. Brynden began to send the dreams to break down the walls of the mind, and then he beckoned him to come his way. It would not be the same. The man's magic was weak and not true, but better to be out and begone than to await the fate that headed his way. Blow the horn and bring me to you, he said softly as he showed the pirate dreams that would never come to pass. King's Landing, 2098 AC, Marguerite. She changed his clothing alone, Joy having left early that morning, and Marguerite already missing her company. As worried as she was about Jay, Joy had a way of almost ignoring it, or more of making her feel as if she could. Marguerite, listening on as she told Jay story after story, as she spoke of the Yentures to come, and of Apples, Winter, Ghost, and Rhaenix too. When she'd first found the girl in their bed, she'd thought she'd seen something in her husband's expression, and she swore that she heard him make sounds that he made with no one else. At times when she touched his cheek or leaned against his chest, she had felt it too, as if he was awake and was watching her. She'd been certain it was only a matter of time, that any day now he'd wake, and so had been more than happy to have Joy come back and spend time with him and with her. Sure that together they'd bring him back home, only to find the days had gone by without him waking. It was now 4 that had passed since that first night, and each one of them had only made her lose that faith a little more. Joy will be back later, Jay. I'm sure she'll have another story for us to enjoy. I like that one best of all. Was that me you were telling her about? Wasn't it? Gods, was that how you saw me? She spoke as if he was answering her questions, and she knew it was something that she'd picked up from Joy. Marjorie finishing dressing him and readying to wash and feed him before people came by to spend some time with them both. It was hard, waking up beside him and then dressing and cleaning him and then herself. Bathing only when someone she trusted was in the room and eating only when she had company that forced her to. Her sleep was fitful. Little sounds would wake her up, and she'd found herself calling out his name more than once. Lords and the rest of the Kingsguard had quickly gotten used to the difference between her tones, knowing when she was worried and when it was nothing for them to be bothered about. Some days were almost like a daze to her, like a dream she couldn't quite remember, and she wondered how she seemed on those days to any who saw her. Did they think she was losing her mind? Was she? It was hard to tell, and the ideas she was having would suggest that she may very well be. Am I mad, Jay? What I intend to do, is it mad? Or is it what you truly need? She asked him, and just as she thought it would be the same and that she'd receive no sign or no reply, she swore she saw his hand move. Hurrying to the bed, she grabbed his hand and brought it to her face, and then she closed her eyes. It is what I must do, isn't it? She said hopefully, and she felt her cheek being touched, startling her so much that she cried out loudly and dropped his hand to the bed. Sarah Sarbarsten both came rushing inside, Marguerite now sitting on the bed, reaching desperately for her husband's hand, a smile on her face as she turned to look at the two knights. When she told them what she wished to do, both of them made ready to talk her out of it, Marguerite quickly rising to her feet and looking intently at them both. I am your queen, and this is my command. See that it's made ready, she said firmly, and leaving no room for question. It took them some time, and she waited by the side of the bed. She'd hurriedly dressed Jay in clothes that he'd not worn in weeks. She struggled to get his boots on, having to almost force them over his feet, and she knew that his coat was barely buttoned, but in her excited state she cared not. When the Kingsguard returned, it was all of them, and not just two, and soon enough, she was being helped to the carriage. The ride itself not taking long, and Rhaenix was already waiting for them when they got there. Marguerite looked on as they carried Jace over to the dragon, as they lay him down beside his sister, and she could see the doubt and worry in their faces. What did they think was going to happen? She wondered, did they think Rhaegar would harm him? That she could? If so, then just looking at the dragon would show that it could never be. How large Rhaegar was, she'd not been able to truly ascertain. She was as large, if not larger, than a pinnacle ship, and her head alone was as big as the carriage they'd arrived in. Yet she and they watched the dragon place it on Jay's chest, and it was done with such gentleness that she wondered if the weight was even felt. "Your Grace, are you sure about this?" Sir Barstan asked, and Margaery nodded as they looked and waited. Margaery then feeling her legs moving without her consent when she saw his hand rise up to touch the dragon's face. "But Yaxel Yoris Targaryen." The woman led him down through cobbled streets, and soon he was walking on a dark paved road, the night moonless and the darkness only lightened by the white of the wolf's fur. He hurried after what he assumed to be both the wolf and the woman, finding them to always stay the same distance away from him, no matter if he ran or walked. After some time, he felt the rain begin to fall, and then the darkness began to lighten. Jay watching as the sun rose in front of him and began to reflect off the buildings he now found himself surrounded by. High into the clouds they rose, their stone polished so smoothly that they looked to be carved out of one piece rather than the many stones most buildings were made from. Jax looked around and found that he now couldn't see either the woman or the white wolf. Instead, there were many other people walking through the streets of what he now knew could only be Valyria. He heard rather than saw the dragons, their roars and their happy trills letting him know they flew somewhere high above him. When he felt his hand be taken, he almost shouted out, Jay, looking down to see the silver-haired girl pulling his hand as she began to walk ahead of him. "Who are you?" he asked, to no reply other than a now more urgent pull on his hand. Knowing there was little else he could do and not wishing to just stand around and hope the answers came to him, he followed after the little girl who smiled at him when he did so. Jado took the chance to look at her more clearly. Her silver hair and deep purple eyes marked her clearly as a Valyrian, and yet there was something familiar about her too. Something he couldn't quite place. She led him down the smooth paved roads, and Jay looked around to see the sheer number of people who were out and about, estimating the city to be even fuller than King's Landing was. How long he walked with the girl, he couldn't tell. It seemed like they'd covered a lot of ground, and yet he didn't feel as if he'd been walking very long at all. The large building she stopped in front of was bigger than the entire Red Keep, and yet it wasn't even close to being the largest one around. Jay, hearing the girl giggle as she let go of his hand and ran up the steps that led to a large gate. "Wait, come back," he shouted after her. But she didn't turn or stop, and then he swore she just seemed to disappear through the still unopened gates. Taking the steps two at a time, he soon found himself standing in front of the gates and almost fell to the ground when he saw the symbol carved into them. The three-headed dragon was red on a black base, and he knew then that this had been his family's home. Reaching out to touch it, he found himself almost falling, and when he stopped himself from doing so and looked around, he found he was now on the other side of the gates. As he walked through a large garden that was even more beautifully laid out than the ones in High Garden, Jay began to hear voices and moved towards them. He saw a tall silver-haired man speaking to two women who could only be related to him, both women dressed very differently. One wore ringmail and bore a sword on her hip. The other wore the most beautiful dress he'd ever seen and was laughing at something, the man said. Jay moved towards them, only for them to seem to fade away the closer he got, and so he continued on, and moved further through the gardens. Soon enough, he heard even more voices and found they came from a small grove, and so he moved towards it. Upon entering it, he saw an old man with braided silver hair sitting and writing in a book, while beside him a small, slim old woman stood, both of them looking over what the man had written. Then just as with the others, they faded away from him as soon as he moved towards them. On and on he walked through the gardens. And then he saw the girl once more. This time she was laughing as a slightly plump man chased after her and called out her name. Rhaegar, Rhaegar, I'm gonna catch you, my little delight. The man called out to the girl's increasing laughter. The more people he saw, the more he began to recognize them. Daeron, the young dragon, Aegon the Unlikely, his great-grandfather, and namesake, Jaehaerys II, each part of the garden, almost seeming to be yet another place, where one of his ancestors took up space, and each time he moved towards any of them, he found them fading from view. By the time he reached the garden closest to the palace itself, he was about to give up any hope that they were anything more than apparitions or phantoms of his mind. Jaehaerys he would have if he'd not seen the white wolf and the dark-haired woman once again. "Jay, this way," she called out, and whether it was the sound of her voice which allowed him to truly place her, or the fact that the sun seemed to dim ever so slightly, Jay found himself running after his mother as she walked into a section of the garden that was surrounded by high hedges. He stopped as soon as he ran past them and into the clearing, looking to see them all sitting down under what was the largest weirwood tree he'd ever seen. His father, mother, and grandmother were speaking, while beside them, Elia spoke to two silver-haired men and a small and beautiful dark-haired girl. Radiance looked his way and smiled before she turned to Egg beside her and pointed in his direction, while Viserys moved to speak to his mother. Jaehaerys moved quickly towards them and almost screamed out as with each step he took the place he was in began to change. The sun stopped shining as brightly, the grass beneath his feet began to turn to stone, and the white bark of the weirwood began to turn dark. He called out to his mother, his father, to his grandmother and his uncle, to Elijah, Egg, and finally to Rhaenys, his words echoing around a much different place. "Let me stay. Let me stay," he shouted out. His voice pained as he fell to his knees and onto the hard rock beneath his feet. How long he stayed kneeling there, and how many tears he shed. He didn't know, but was it not for the sound of a woman's voice singing, he'd not have had the strength to rise to his feet. Jay wiped his eyes and followed the sound of the woman's voice, and soon found himself to be walking through the keep at Dragonstone. Down corridor after corridor he walked, each one leading him closer until he came to a room with an open door and saw a silver-haired girl singing a song as she wrote into a book. "You came," she said happily when she saw him. "I knew you would." "Who are you?" he asked. "You know who I am, and that's not the question you need to ask, Yars. The question is, who are you?" The girl asked, looking at him. I'm lost," he said softly. "I know, but you have to lose yourself before you can be found, do you not?" "Where am I?" he asked, moving into the room. "You're here, silly," she said with a melodic giggle. "But I'm not supposed to be here, am I?" "You were always supposed to be here. It's only from here you can go there," she said, pointing to the window. He followed her hand and saw the Red Keep and then the Dragon Pit. Rhaenys, Margaery, Sir Arthur, and Sir Barristan all around, something on the ground. And then as he looked beyond them, he swore he saw the gates of the palace in Valyria too. "I want to go home," he said, looking to her. "But where's your home, Jaehaerys? Is it where you live or where you're from?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "As good an answer as any, one day you will. Until that day comes, you need to read this. You'll find the answers you seek inside," she said, handing him her journal before stepping up from her seat and walking to another door in the room and opening it. Jaxlier, seeing a bright light shining through it. "Don't go," he said, looking to her. "We'll meet again, Jaxley. For now, read the song. It'll explain some of what you need to know." She said. "What song?" he asked. "Open the book," she said, and he looked down to see the writing on the page. "Who are you?" he asked as she smiled at him before she walked through the door. He sat down on the seat that she'd just left and looked down at the page, the words of the song written clearly. "One dream, one soul, one prize, one goal, one golden glance of what should be. It's a kind of magic, one shaft of light that shows the way. No mortal man can win this day. It's a kind of magic. The bell that rings inside your mind is challenging the doors of time. It's a kind of magic. The waiting seems eternity. The day will dawn of sanity. Is this a kind of magic? There can be only one. This rage that lasts 1,000 years will soon be gone. This flame that burns inside of me, I'm hearing secret harmonies. It's a kind of magic. The bell that rings inside your mind is challenging the doors of time. This rage that lasts 1,000 years will soon be gone. This is a kind of magic. There can be only one." The light was blinding as he closed the book over. Jay looked at it as it shined through the door that the girl had left open. As he rose to his feet, he heard the sound of a bell ring out, and he walked into the light. She was in his arms as soon as he did so, her lips on his cheek as she kissed him repeatedly, and Jay looked up into her brown eyes and saw the tears as they fell down her face. His fingers brushed them away as his wife's smile showed that it wasn't sadness that made them fall. "Margaery," he said softly as she kissed his lips. "King's Landing, 288 AC. Barristan." The relief he felt at seeing the king awake was soon tempered when, as he tried to rise to his feet, Jaxlier's instead crumbling to the ground. Both he and Arthur hurried over to him, and when they got there, they found the king to be actually laughing. "It seems my legs are being most uncooperative." Sorez, yes, it with a large smile on his face, one that Barristan was happy to see the queen, seemed to be matching. "Lean on me, your grace," Arthur said as he knelt down and took one of the king's arms before wrapping it around his neck, Barristan quickly doing the same with the other. They helped him back to the carriage and placed him inside, the queen nodding to them both as she climbed in beside him, giving the orders to the guards that were with them and looking to see that Arthur was just as relieved as he was, they quickly mounted up and set off back to the Red Keep. As they rode, Barristan kept his eyes firmly on the carriage beside them, but he was soon moving even closer to it. The knight, thinking something was wrong when the shutters were opened and both the king and queen's heads stuck out from inside. "Your Grace, are you well?" he asked, worriedly. "Very much so, Sir Barristan. My wife informed me that it's been a number of weeks since the people saw either of us. I'd seek to rectify that immediately," the king said. He found himself chuckling at that and then feeling some pride when he heard the cheering of people when they saw both the king and queen. Jane Sierras and Marjorie simply waving and smiling at them all as the carriage passed by. Barristan knew, though, how much it would mean to a lot to them to see them both. The small folk, too, had begun to worry about their king's health, and those steps had been taken to reassure them. No step they had taken would work as well as this one. By the time they reached the Red Keep, the word had spread, the crowds had grown larger as they moved through the city, and the cheers louder still, which had alerted those in the keep to what had occurred. Barristan saw the large party that awaited their arrival, the Lannisters, Starks, the Martells, and the Tyrells, all among many others that were represented. Moving to the carriage, he leaned inside to see the king was shaking his arms vigorously while trying to rise to his feet, and then he watched as he fell back to the seat. So he nodded to Arthur, and they helped him out from the carriage, both of them supporting his weight as they walked him into the keep. "I'll speak to you all presently inside," the king said, and Barristan could see that he would need to do so almost immediately. Such were the eager looks on each of the faces. He also noticed that even the servants stopped to look and give both the king and queen warm smiles as he and Arthur helped him to his chambers. Once inside, it was to the large seat behind the desk they moved the king at his behest, rather than his bed or the more comfortable couches that were also in the room. It was something the queen wasn't best pleased about, but the king was insistent upon, and Barristan found himself smirking at the standoff that was now going on between them. "I need to speak to them, just to let them know I feel well and am unharmed," Marjorie said. "You need to rest and to be looked over by the Graham Poxter and your Uncle Jag." Marjorie replied, "I've rested for weeks, have I not? I have to this, my love. Just to let them know I'm well. It'll be brief, and you can call for Gormod and Emon before then, if you wish." Jag says, with a soft smile on his face, "I only want to be sure you truly are unhurt, Jay," Marjorie said softly, and Barristan turned away to give them privacy as the king and queen began to kiss each other softly. It took some time for both Prince Aemon and the Graham Aster to be brought to the room, both men quickly examining the king and finding there to be no lasting damage or further injury. Barristan listened intently as both the prince and the Graham Aster explained that the reason the king couldn't rise or use his feet was nothing more than because he'd been abed for the last few weeks, and that over the next few days he'd gain his strength back. "Good, perhaps then I can put my own boots on and do so correctly," the king said, rolling his eyes as he looked to the queen, who Barristan was glad to see was grinning back at him. He could see there was still some worry in the queen's features, still some concerns even after the Gramseer, and the prince had done their utmost to reassure her, and the king that all was well. Barristan could tell that she wished to just spend the rest of the day alone with her husband, but that circumstances didn't allow it. "Send for the others, says. I care not what order, but perhaps it's best to keep the young ones together," the king said. "And Joy, last of all," Marjorie said, which had the king frowning until she nodded at him. "And Joy, last of all," Jaxley Harris said, and Barristan set about doing as he was bid. The reunions were far briefer than either the king or those coming to see him wished for. Daenerys spending far more time with the children than with the adults, and Barristan wondering if the queen had told him that they'd not been allowed to see him when he was ill. Perhaps, though, it was simply they wished for more contact, as his words didn't seem to be enough for some of them. His sisters both needing to be held, and his young squire needing to have his hair mussed before any of them seemed to relax truly. As for the adults, it was clear to any just how relieved and happy they were to see the king up and about, or as up and about as he could be, for the next few days. Barristan watched as his uncles, his aunts, Lady Olenna and Sir Lors and the older Lannisters all made their feelings clear. Jacksonese asking for a moment alone with Lord Jaime before giving word for the young Lannister girl, Joy, to be brought in. The smile on the king's face when he saw the young girl run to him was beaming. "I believe I have you to thank, Joy," Jaxlier said as the girl sat on his lap before he could even bid her to. "Me and Balon, John Margie too," Joy said, looking to the queen. "Aye, Margie too," the king said, smiling at his wife. And don't forget Ghost and Rhaenys, the queen said. No, we must never forget them. Mustn't we not, Joy? The king said, looking to the girl and nodding. No, we must not, Joy said determinedly. Despite not being his blood as Daenerys, Sansa, or Arya were considered such by bonds of family as Prince Oberyn's daughters were, it was clear to any with eyes to see that there was no one who was more of a sister to his king than the girl he was presently speaking and laughing with. The girl had even managed to sneak into his chambers by herself, though she did have help from the Black Cat, he later found out. Barstan had wondered if it was that, the fact that his true sister's cat had taken so well to the girl that made them so close. But Ser George had told him that it had ever been so. Back in the Rock, barely a day would go by, and you'd not see them together, Lord Commander, inseparable the king and her, Ser Jace had said happily. Arthur had suggested that it was the loss of family that drove Jane so. The idea of what had happened to Elzira, Rhaenys, and Aegon that had made him welcome so many to replace them in his heart. Theristan, though, didn't truly agree with his brother on that. True, it played its part, but it wasn't the reason, as far as he was concerned. Instead, he believed his king was good. True, that he was possessed of a heart that needed to be full, and so over time, he'd accepted people into it to make it so. You can take the night good, sirs. I'll not leave my bed until the morrow, the king said as they helped him to it. Food, Jack? Margaery asked. Well, we'd best try not and make a mess, my love, the king said, making it clear he was staying true to his word. We'll be outside, your grace, Arthur said before he could. Take the night. Have some of Sir Bonifer's men take over door duty. Ghost is on his way and will be inside the room. Rest up. We've work to do on the morrow, and you may end up carrying me around for a few days, the king said, both japing and seeming frustrated at the thought of it. By your leave, your grace, he said with a bow to both the king and queen, receiving a nod from them both as he and Arthur turned to leave. Later that night, he was sitting in White Sword Tower, he, Arthur, Jorah, and Walder. Sir Lars and Sir Richard were on duty with other members of the royal family, and so it was just the four of them in the tower. They had eaten their meals and were now sitting at the table, just relaxing after the day. It was rare that any of them would drink, even off duty. Both he and Arthur didn't truly partake. Nor did Walder and Jorah did so, only occasionally. Tonight, though, he sat there and opened the bottle before filling out the 4 glasses with the finest arbor that he'd been able to find. He'd worried terribly. The thoughts of only just beginning his service with his king, only to see it come to a premature end, were ones that he'd tried his damnedest not to entertain, but ones that came all the same. 3 years he'd gotten to serve a good king before he'd passed. And then it had been followed with almost 4 decades of serving bad ones. So the fear that he'd spend even less time serving the namesake of the only other good king he'd served was a true and real one. Not even the calming words of Sarah Walder had truly made his worries go away. His brother had told them all of the events in the Riverlands and of just how strong magically their king actually was. It had been comforting, but not fully. Only seeing the king's eyes open and hearing his voice had been able to do that. To the king, he said, raising his glass. To the king, his brothers replied, each of them feeling just as he was, relieved and eager for the days yet to come. The Lion's Tale 2098 AC. Benjen Stark. One thing became very clear. Not long after the 2 red priestesses arrived at the wall, and that was that one of them was anything but. Kinvara was most definitely what she said. She was, her mannerisms and the way that both of the guards deferred to her made that most clear. Vel, however, was not, and it didn't take him too long to figure out that she was in fact a wilding. It made him wonder just why a wilding was coming with them to see his nephew and just exactly what type of mission Jack had sent the Red Priestess on in the first place. He had found himself excited to be leaving, though, to see his nephew once more and to spend time with his other nieces and nephew as well. Sansa, Arya, and Robb had been fostering for some time, and it had been many years since he'd been lucky enough to see them all. How keen he was to see King's Landing or the Red Keep depended entirely on the thoughts which filled his head on which day. On some, he was lucky enough to just think about the family he had there now, while on others, his thoughts would go only to the family that he'd lost. Saying goodbye to the wall was not as hard as he'd envisioned it. It would be either. Not for him, and certainly not for Sir Ozzer, Sir Jeremy, and the other loyalists. Benjang was, though, happy enough that what it was gaining in experienced men far outweighed the loss of him and a few others. They'd also been lucky enough to be sent some men who would help out greatly. Some Dornish lords and knights who were most experienced, and Lord Stannis Baratheon, who he knew Jar would make great use of. As he put the final of his belongings onto the cart and turned to call for Frost, who seemed even keener than the Red Priestess to leave, he looked to see the Lord Commander walking his way. "Well, Stark, I can't say I'm happy to see you leave, though you along with your nephew will see us right. A voice, Benjen. You have a voice at the table. Use it so we're not forgotten." Yadra said as his annoying bird called out for corn. "I will. Jackyer, I'll see you again, one day," he said with a smile. "Aye, one day, good fortune to you, Benjen. I'm proud to have served with ya." "Me too, Gier," he said, shaking the man's hand and then accepting the letters he gave him to deliver to his family. Frost finally coming to his side, they mounted up and set off and began the long ride to Eastwack. Benjen, finding that each mile he rode away from Castle Black made him feel less and less a Black brother, even if he still wore the clothes. When he glanced at Kinvara and Val, he could see one looked to be as comfortable as ever. Kinvara riding her horse as if she was simply strolling through a meadow on a fine summer's day, while Val looked as if she wished to be anywhere but here. It took him some time to realize it wasn't the horse that caused her such discomfort, but the clothing. So as they camped that night and Frost went off to hunt, Benjen decided to rectify that at least. "Here," he said, walking over to both Kinvara and Val, and carrying the bundle of clothing before dropping it in the blonde's lap. "What's this?" Val asked, almost angrily. "It may serve you better than that dress you're so uncomfortable in," he said simply as he walked away and sat beside Sarah Lazar and Sarah Jeremy, both men laughing and japing as they told tales of Targaryens that were long since dead. The next morning, when he looked and saw Val on the horse, Benjen felt his breath catch and his throat begin to dry. He took a quick swallow of his water to both fix the latter and give him the chance to hide the former. Val was a beautiful woman, even when compared to the woman that she rode with. Seeing her in the red dress, he'd been like others awed by just how pretty she truly was, that compared to now, though, was like night and day. If before she had been beautiful, then, as she was right now, she was otherworldly, and he wasn't alone in noticing just how incredible she looked. As they rode over the next few days, he and others found themselves glancing at Val more than once, and by the time they finally reached Eastwatch, Benjen had reckoned he'd looked at her far more than the path they'd traveled. Frost had run ahead of them, the wolf off hunting in the distance, and only when the small village had come into view had he come back. "Is that one of the king's ships?" Cyril Lazir asked, awed by the sheer size of the ship that was docked and waiting for them. "It is from the king's own design," Kinvara said, and Benjen's head turned to her to see that she was speaking true. If seeing it from the docks made it look impressive, then boarding it and being shown to their rooms only made it even more so. Benjen soon finding his cabin to be on a pat with the rooms he was given when he would return to Winterfell. Sarazir and Sarah Jeremy and the other loyalists also were suitably impressed, but it was Val who was most so. Both in the quality of her room and in the way the ship glided through the waters as if the waves barely registered when they hit against its hull. "I've never seen the likes of this," she said, standing at the bow and looking out as they sailed south through the Bay of Seals and toward the Grey Cliffs. "Not even in Essos?" he said softly. "When the fuck was I in Essos?" she snapped before she caught herself. "I knew you were a wilding," he said with a smirk as he looked at her. "Free folk crow were called free folk," she said, her anger at him dampened slightly by her annoyance at herself for being caught out. "Why are you traveling to speak to my nephew, Val?" he asked. And whether it was his concern for Jayu that came across in his voice or expression, her features softened and Benjen was almost lost in her eyes, that for now looked bluer than the gray they sometimes appeared. "For help," she said softly. "Against the watch?" he asked. "Against the dead," she said, catching him by surprise before she walked away. Benjen looked at her as she did so. Her breeches were a pair of his own that had grown too small for him, as was her shirt, tunic, and cloak, and yet she wore them far better than he or anyone else could ever have done. There was a grace in how she walked, and it was impossible not to see and acknowledge it. Benjen finding himself drawn to that grace and having to quickly turn away when his thoughts went far beyond any that he'd had in years. Looking out on the water as it seemed to almost part before the ship, he began to think about what she said. They'd hear tale of the wildings moving, talk of them banding together under yet another king beyond the wall. He, Jaeger, and others all dismissed it, given the nature of the wildings themselves, as they knew the wildings could never truly agree with each other on anything. But if what Val was suggesting was true, even if it was only believed so by the wildlings alone, then it would give them a reason to choose another king and to join their clans with his. He turned to Frost and hurriedly walked from the bow, down the stairs, and up to the room before knocking hard on the door and waiting for the reply. Some of the other men stuck their heads out of their doors upon hearing the loudness of the knocks, but Benjen waved them away, and then, finally, the door opened. His eyes were quickly drawn to the eyes of the woman in front of him as were hers to his. "I've been wondering when you'd come to see me, Lord Stark," Kinvara said as she opened the door further so that he could walk inside. King's Landing 2098 AC. Jaime here is Targaryen. He had done his best to reassure everyone that he was well and that he would recover, some accepting it far more than others, his sisters being some of the ones who'd not simply accepted his words and Jade had needed to hug, to speak softly, and to even laugh and jape with them before they did so. With some of the others, he knew there were more questions to be faced, but he found he was not ready to offer answers just yet. No, that wasn't quite the truth. He wasn't sure he had the answers to those questions himself, just yet. Joy, though, gods, just listening to her speak so excitedly and tell him of how she'd managed to sneak into his room and how Balin had helped her do so. She used soon enough, finding himself close to tears. He'd laughed so much, listening as she spoke so annoyedly about them not letting her come to see him, and how much she knew that he needed her too. He'd done his utmost to reassure her that he was back and that he wouldn't leave in such a way again. Joy making him promise her, before she'd accept it, that along with a promise to go riding and to spend time with her was her price for her agreeing to leave that night, and it was one he gladly paid. "I thought they'd never go," his wife said as she brought the tray toward him. The 2 plates of food looking hot and appetizing, though he wasn't sure if he was truly hungry. He ate it all, though, cleaned his plate thoroughly as he knew that his family and the others were not the only ones who needed to be reassured. Jaime had seen her watch him as he spoke, and when he was being helped to the bed, it was something she'd done even more keenly when he began to take food from the plate, and so, despite him being full less than a little way through, he'd finished it all and been rewarded with a full smile. "Leave them until the morrow," he said when she made ready to leave the room. Marguerite nodding and placing the tray on the table. "Ghost may have been expecting leftovers," she said with a smirk, as she moved to the bed. "I'm sure he received great care and ate well when I was—" Jack stopping himself when he saw the beginnings of a worried frown appear on Marguerite's face. He held his hand out, and she took it as she climbed into the bed. Jaime putting his arm around her shoulder, and Marguerite lay leaning in close to him. After kissing her forehead, he began to rub his arm on her back, feeling her lean in even closer to him. They lay there silently for a few moments. Marguerite obviously had questions, and Jay was trying to form the answers to whatever they could be in his mind. When he decided he was being stupid and that he should be the one to offer up answers before he was asked. "I'm well, Marge. I can't even begin to imagine how you felt, but I am well. I needed this, as hard as that may be to hear. I needed this to happen, and to happen here," he said. "Why? I don't understand. Tell me, Jack. Please. I need to know, all of it. Don't leave anything out," she said, and he kissed her forehead once more before nodding at her. He told her then about what he'd seen, what he'd experienced, and how some of it was real, and some was not. Marguerite adding in little things that had happened while he was asleep, such as Joy coming to see him, her own conversations with him, and finally bringing him to see Rhaegar. She told him about his uncle coming and spending time with him and speaking on his mother, how she'd sat and listened as Ned had told him stories from his childhood. That's why it had to be here. What he showed me, what I saw, it was as if he created a life for me inside my head. A dream that wasn't a dream, and without it, without what you all did, then I think I may have stayed there," he said, and felt her stiffen against him. "You'd have left me alone?" she said, her voice sounding sadder than he could bear. "Never," he said, forcing her to look at him and seeing the dampness in her eyes as he kissed her hard and deep. "Never," he said again, even more firmly, and saw her nod. Jay then explained what the dream had been, of how his family had been alive and he'd grown up as a prince in the Red Keep alongside them. He noticed the small smile that appeared on her face when he spoke of crowning her his queen of love and beauty, and then of his joy when his father had announced they were to be man and wife. "But it wasn't real, it wasn't the same, was it?" she asked. "No, I saw a ghost of my mother and I don't. Something felt wrong and I didn't know now what it was, but now I do," he said. "What?" she asked, intrigued. "He didn't have the others there, the people I care about, the rest of my family. He had Rainscenes and Agag, my father and Ilie. He had Dainty and Viserys and my grandmother. He had my family, but not all of my family. he said, and she nodded as she kissed his cheek. So you realized it wasn't true? My mother and Ghost? I think that was my uncle's stories. After that I saw Rhaenyra, but it wasn't her. I mean, it was, but not only her. Rhaenyra from the dance. I saw her, but she was a young girl. I think that was Joy, he said, smiling as he told her then of the rest of what he saw. She listened as he explained about Daenerys and about the book, about the fact that he would need to deal with Bloodraven and that he wasn't the only one that he'd need to face. Jaime hating that he was worrying her so, but feeling that she needed to know the full truth. When it came to how he'd actually finally made it back, she looked on in shock as he told her that her bringing him to Rhaenys had been what had given him the strength to do so. Magic, Marge, it's all magic, he said with a smile. They didn't lay together truly that night. James had found himself tired, and Marguerite was far more content just being held by him than to wish for anything more. He offered as much comfort as he could to her and spoke softly to her until she finally drifted off to sleep. A promise that he'd be awake on the morrow being asked for and given before she did so. When he did wake, it was to her looking down at him, a smile on her face, when she saw his eyes open. He tried to rise and stand and found some feeling was coming back, but there was no strength in his legs, and he fell to the ground. Sotarathur and Sut Barristan both coming to his aid, and Jaethan being dressed by his wife and his Kingsguard, much to his embarrassment. Not so much with Marguerite, as he knew by then that she'd done this alone all the while he'd been lost in dreams, but having Sotarathur and Sottar Barristan present was not something he enjoyed. Once dressed, they broke their fast, and Jay called for Jaime and Oberyn to explain to him what was going on in the realm, the time long past when they needed to get back to work. Finding out that Lady Catelyn had arrived and that Willis, Wyman, and Sarah Richard had gone to Brevaeus amongst the many other things he'd missed left him with odd feelings. Excitement knowing that Littlefinger would soon be trapped along with his concern over how to handle Lady Catelyn and how it would be viewed by family and by others. He listened as Jaime told him of the few other events that had occurred, Harold Hardyng's Raven among them, and his jape that perhaps the realm didn't truly need him did not go down as well as he hoped. After that, he then met with the Grandmaster, who told him to do as much as he could with his legs, and that in a day or two he'd be up and about. Jape feeling frustrated that it would take a little longer for him to feel back to himself. Once Gorman had left, Jay readied himself for the far more important thing he needed to do, the knowledge swirling around his head ever since he'd woke up. I need to speak to Aemon and the others. Can you arrange for them to come to me, just the Targaryens? He asked. Sarathur and Marguerite looked at him. Am I to be excluded? She asked. No, my love. No, you'll need to be here for this also, he said as Arthur went to do what he requested. Beyond the wall, 2098 AC. Leaf. The sap had worked completely and hid her intentions and actions from the Raven. Leaf knowing then she could do what needed to be done. Each time she would stand in his presence and see that he was only seeing what he wished, it made her think about just ending him there and then. Just taking her knife and sticking it through his one good eye, and if she believed that it would release her brother and sisters and protect her prince, then she would do it in the beat of a heart. It wouldn't though, and her brothers and sisters would turn on her, and though her own life was a price she was willing to pay, theirs was not. So she instead came up with a different plan, and one which would require her to stay close and to do some of the things the Raven bid. Some, but not all, and should he ask her or any of her brothers and sisters to take a life, then she would act against him without hesitation. Acorn was first, then Twig, and then she moved on to the others, bringing them with her when she went to the tree and removed the sap. Always waiting until the Raven was elsewhere before she did so. How she knew when he was looking at them and not at someone else was unknown to her. But she found that she was always aware. The feeling of being watched was not one that she welcomed, and yet one that she knew was very much needed, especially so that she could continue her work. What about the others? Twig asked her the day she'd turned him to their side. We must be careful, one and one only, even should it take us weeks or moons to bring them all, she replied. And once we're done? Acorn asked. I don't know, for now, let's make sure we free every one of us, she said to it. The days turned to weeks. And then moons, Twig turning others when she could not, or Acorn doing so when Twig could not. Each of those she turned asked her questions that she had not the answer to, and Leaf had begun to wonder if she ever would. As it came down to only 2 or 3 of them left to turn, the questions became too much to bear, and so when she went to gather the sap, or when she made the paste for the Raven to eat, Leaf put those questions to the gods. It seemed as if she would receive no answers from them either, and she began to despair, to worry that there was, indeed, no plan. And if so, then what was she to do? Was she to simply wait, or to act, to stay, to go? And if she was to leave, then where would there be safety for her and the others? Their prince would see them to safety. He would find them a home where they could live in peace. But until he came, if he came, a voice at the back of her head, which she tried to ignore, said, until he came, they would find no peace in the world of men. As much help as they may be able to offer to the free folk, what they were and who they were would soon see them turned upon just as they always had been. The word of men was not to be trusted, and even the smallest, youngest of their people knew this to be true. Without their prince and now without the raven, they were lost. Leaf wondered if perhaps it would have been better to have been left in blissful ignorance of the truth of the man they served. Still, she knelt at the tree when she could, and she prayed often, hoping for an answer to come. You are our first, our chosen, and we would never abandon you, the voice called out as she knelt today. You will not? She asked, hopefully. We've shown you the truth. Why would we do so? Only to let you fall. I do not know such things as the minds of gods, she said, though her voice, like the one that spoke to her, went unheard. To any other, as to all who watched it, seemed that she knelt silently in front of the tree. Mistakes were made, mistakes that even we could not foresee, but we've also foreseen the truth of things to come. We have sent out a prince that was promised, and that promise is soon to be fulfilled. What do you wish from us? She asked. Prepare for what's to come, gather your strength, and free your people. The prince will do the rest. And the raven will soon face his own end. What is to come after? She asked. When the prince comes our way, freedom and a place to call your own, the voice called out. Later that day, as they sat around the cave and ignored the calls from the thing in the tree, Leaf looked to each and every one of her brothers and sisters. They were free of mind and of anyone's control, free to make their own choices just as it should be. As the fire burned, she began to speak to them of the home they'd soon have, of the magic that existed there, and of how the gods had willed it so. To the holiest of all places we shall go. Our prince to see us safely there, she said, seeing the excitement rise on each and every face. The island of the gods, Acorn said. Where their eye sees all, Twig said. The Isle of Faces, Leaf said, and she knew it was only a matter of time until their prince's own eyes looked their way. King's Landing, 298 AC. Ned Stark, he knew that they'd be here now until the babe was born, and so he'd given leave to his lords and sent them back north. The great and small gins having already left, as had Lord Demeric Bolton, Ned finding to his surprise that the young lord was meeting his newly betrothed along the way. That she was a girl from the Vale and a Royce to boot, only making him wonder whether Rose would have allowed him to wed, and then raising questions over the Leech Lord's demise. Questions that El soon put to rest, and which allowed him to wish the young lord well in his future marriage. He'd sent ravens back to Winterfell to let them know what was going on, and was now holding a dinner with Lady Janna and Lady Myrcella. Ostensibly, it was to discuss her and Bran's betrothal and future seat, but more so he could see how suitable the girl was for his son. The girl was soon showing just how nervous she was, and Ned tried to do his very best to offer her any reassurance that he could. Once again finding Elle to be far better at it than he, as she asked Myrcella to join her, though it had then left him alone to deal with her far more imposing great-aunt. My nephew will pay a dowry, of course. One which should cover the hiring of new guards and ensure the keep is more than adequately protected in the future, Janna said. I thank you, my lady, though it's not necessary. The wedding is at his grace's behest, and so no dowry is required. No, perhaps not, but it will be provided all the same, Lord Stark, which brings me to Marsad and young Brandon themselves. I had wished to meet him, Lord Stark, to judge your son just as you are doing with my great niece. Jane said, looking at him. There's no need to be coy, Lord Stark. I'm well aware of why you asked us to join you. As I said, I had wished to do so with young Brandon just the same. However, recent events have made that unable to occur, so I have a request to ask of you, one I'm sure his grace would agree to, Janna said. And that is, my lady, he asked curiously, that when you arrive back at Winterfell and young Brandon and Sir Brynden head here to swear their fealty, they do so by ship and with a stop off at Casterly Rock. It would kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, Lord Stark. I could take the measure of the boy who's to marry Marcella, and they both could actually get to meet one another as well. Genna said. He looked at the woman and began to ponder her request, despite the denials that was exactly what he wished to do at this night's dinner. And so he felt he really couldn't deny her the chance to do likewise. Besides, it would be good for Bran to have some sort of relationship with the family of the girl he was to marry, and it could perhaps even smooth over some of the doubts that Marcella and his son would no doubt have. "I can find no fault in your suggestion, my lady. I'll see it's done," he said, as Ed and Marcella came back into the room. The girls seeming now to be in much better spirits. By the time they actually left, he found himself almost won over by the girl herself. She was smart and witty, despite her young age, and though the wedding itself would be many years away, he could clearly see the benefits it would bring. Some of his bannermen had taken issue, not just with both Bran and Sansa, now due to marry in the south, but with Bran being married to a base-born girl, Ned telling them to take it up with the king and to speak to him about Marcella's status if they dared. He knew full well that they would not, and if anything, it was truly only Rickard Karstark who was upset. The man had seen both Dalmeric and now Bran taken from his reach. Tough a betrothal with Lord Hallett's Hornwood's heir, Darren was now being suggested. "You look tired, my love," he said to Elle, as he tried not to think about politics and inconsequential matters, and instead looked at his wife. "I am, and my feet hurt," she said as she took off her shoes. "Give me," he said, sitting on the bed and rubbing first one and then the other, and hearing his wife's contented sigh as she lay back on the bed. He woke early the next morning and found that he was not looking forward to what he needed to do. The time was fast approaching, and he knew he could put it off no longer. Less so now that Jaime was awake, though he'd only spoken to his nephew briefly and knew it would take him a few days to turn his mind to Cat, turn his mind to her. He surely would. So after eating as much as he could manage and rubbing Lozia's head before letting her out to go and spend time with her pack while wishing that he could do likewise, he readied himself for what he must do. Ned slowly made his way down to the cells and was soon enough at the corridor she was housed in. He felt the sweat begin to pool on his hands when the jailer opened the door, and taking a deep breath, he walked inside. "Ned." "Oh, thank the Seven. I knew you'd not abandon me so," Cat said, and he looked at her and shook his head. "Abandon you so? Do you think I'm here to help you? After all, you did. You truly think I'm here to come to your aid?" he said disbelievingly. "I did it for our children, only for our children," she said, looking to him. "For our children?" he said, his voice raised. "You did this for you, Cat, not for them. You think they wished it from you? That they'd have been happy if you'd managed to take their brother from them," he said, his anger forcing his voice to sound almost guttural. "He's not their brother," she said, spitefully. "He is their brother. In each and every way, he is their brother. He may not have come from you or from me, but don't you ever doubt that Jaime is as true a brother to our girls or boys as they are to each other and to him," he shouted. "So, you'll do nothing to help me. You'll let him take my head, or worse, feed me to his dragon. Do I mean so little to you now that you have your new wife?" she said, her voice bitter and her face snarling, and Ned, noticing just how old she had begun to look. "I was not alone in marrying another. Now was I, Cat? Where is your own husband? Why has he not come to your aid? As for Jaime, he'll show you far more mercy than I would were it my choice to make." "Mercy? You expect me to plead for mercy from that," she never finished, as he moved close to her and saw her shrink back fearfully. "Speak those words aloud. Do so, and let them hear you say them, and see then what fate you get. Perhaps you'll find it's the one you deserve for trying to have a child killed, for hating someone who'd done no more to you than being born." "And what of what you've done to me?" she asked angrily, as he stood and looked at her. "I've made my peace with it," he said, moving to the door. "Ned, please, the children, speak to him, to the king. Ask him to allow my children to visit me, to not keep them away from me, in his spite," she said, and he looked at her and found that she was truly no longer a person. He recognized. "You think they're being stopped from coming to see you? Are you truly that far gone? They're free to see you if they wish. Perhaps you should reflect upon that. They could come to see you, Cat. They just don't wish to," he said as he walked from the cell. He hurried away from the cell block and made his way up the stairs, seeing that Ladye hadn't gone to her pack, but had waited for him, and he was more than happy to see her there. Ned kneeling down and rubbing the wolf's head and feeling the calm come over him almost immediately. "Lord Stark," he heard a voice call out and looked to see it was one of the men of the new royal guard. "Aye," he said, "from his grace." The man said, handing him a note which Ned quickly opened. Uncle Benjen has arrived with some other visitors. As much as I wish I could go welcome him myself, I find I cannot. I would ask you to join with Prince Oberyn and travel to the docks to welcome him and them, and if you could explain my absence, I'd most appreciate it. I'll speak to Uncle Benjen and to yourself later. But for now, I'd ask you to stand in my stead. Yacht. Prince Oberyn, he asked the guard, awaits. If you'd like to follow me, Lord Stark, the guard said, and he did so eagerly. Finding he was most keen to see his brother again, and as he looked at Lya, he could see that he wasn't the only one who sought a reunion.